For this week's Elestrals Casual Tournament, I am bringing Shiveroar. If this is your first time viewing the series, each week for the Elestrals Casual Tournament, I am going over my deck for that week, what I hope it can do, the deck list, and then I'll cut to after the tournament to discuss my run and how the deck performed, any changes I want to make, and just some kind of closing thoughts. So with that out of the way, as I said, I'm bringing Shiveroar. Pretty much the goal of the deck is to get the Shiveroar out on board, get the Mountains of Boreas up so it has targeting protection, while also being able to accelerate Frost Spirits to your board to just beat down the opponent with its big stat, and with extra spirits, just dealing extra spirit damage. Getting into the deck list, I run 2 copies of Shiveroar, as well as 3 copies of Mountains of Boreas. So Shiveroar here, while it is the main focus of the deck, I've found that when trying to run 2 costs, it usually is better to run 2. That way you can more easily find it, or you can expect to more easily find it over the course of the game, but you're not running so many that you're finding multiple copies. Because once you find multiple copies, you're really breaking on this. And Shiveroar isn't exactly a card that I'm accelerating into. It's more of just a late game, strong play push to try to close out the game. But in converse, Mountains of Boreas is very good throughout multiple stages of the game, especially since more decks are running Stadium Room, so I can just use it to pop the opponent's Stadium Room. Thus, I run to run 3 copies to maximize my chances of finding it, and maximizing my chances to have it lined up when I do go into my Shiveroar. Because I do require my Stadium, I do run 3 copies of Jolten just to make sure I can find it. Again, Stadium does have more applications than just giving Shiveroar the targeting protection, so it is a more central focus of the deck. It pretty much is what I base a lot of my deck choices around, the fact that I'm also running Stadium, and Shiveroar is just kind of that cherry on top here. So 3 Jolten to make sure I can consistently get into it, and the 4 attack's really good in the early game. One card that pairs nicely with running Stadium is, of course, the Frigicub here. It also has the ability to get more spirits on board just through the Nexus ability, meaning that I can gain a lot of stat boosts from the Stadium to put pressure on the opponent, also force some damage. It also is a good Frost Celestial to be able to ascend into the Shiveroar off of, and as you'll see with this deck, this is virtually the only 1-cost Frost Celestial I run, which seems crazy because I am trying to ascend into the Shiveroar, but the reason why is outside of Morfrost, there really wasn't any other 1-cost that seemed very good to run in this deck. And I considered just running the Shiveroar on top of the Morfrost package because that's a super consistent and solid package in its own right. But at that point, I was thinking it might just be a worse version of the Cryovern version of the Morfrost deck. And I really don't want to just run another worse version of a deck like I did last week. Or potentially, I shouldn't say that it is, but it potentially is, so I decided to go a completely different route to test it out, and I thought the Frigicub was a cool way to go about it. But of course, if this is the only Frost Celestial, I need a way to actually find it, and thankfully, we've got 4 copies of Narpoon here to help search it out. And this kind of shows that this deck is trying to play it a bit slower, hence why the Shiveroar can come out a bit later. But ideally, we're either finding a Frigicub throughout the game or a Narpoon to be able to search it out. Also, Narpoon's really good, or at least decent with the 4 attack stat for some early game pushes, kind of like the Jolten. Since I do run the Narpoon and am trying to ascend, I thought 1 Emphrostix was appropriate. If I get a Frigicub into the Underworld, I can just Emphrostix it back and then immediately ascend into the Shiveroar as a decent play. Or if I just want to swarm the board to try to make a final push, I can always ascend a Frigicub into Shiveroar, Emphrostix, bring it back, and I've got 2 bodies on board that I can start Nexusing with to bring back even more spirits to put on even more pressure on board. And of course, I've got the Narpoon to be able to search it out. So if I already found a Frigicub, I can just search this guy out and just be sitting on it for that big push. Now, of course, with Frigicub, if I'm using its Nexus effect, I really don't want to Nexus off a Stadium because I want the Stadium to be able to buff up my Frigicub and then eventually work with giving the Shiveroar the protection effect. So I need another Nexus bank, and what better than the Khione here? So I run 1 copy of it along with the 4 copies of Elechik to find it. And the reason I'm only running 1 copy is I found I have tested this deck a bit. This isn't me going in blind. I've found that I only really need the 1 copy to set up for those plays. Otherwise, it's just kind of a dead card in hand since I can only loop back Frost Celestial, so I need to find Frigicub first or an Emphrostix to be able to utilize it. So just being able to, and I've got time in the game because I'm playing all these Searcher cards to kind of build up these pieces to then start making plays. And these Searcher pieces are solid attack style Elestrals in their own right, so the opponent probably wants to try to start using some counter runes to answer these search pieces because they are putting on pressure, and it just means that I can kind of load up for a big turn later on. And Khione definitely comes up, especially when I'm only running 3 Frigicub. That way, even if I find one early and I can cast it out safely, it goes, I can loop it back with Khione and try again. So This ratio was working out pretty well in the limited testing I have done, hoping it'll work out well in the tournament. But also, because I'm running these 3 Elechik, I did decide to run the 1 copy of Zeus, because this is also a really solid Divine Rune for utility, especially with all these 4 attack Elestrals. I don't have any 5 attack 1 drops in here, and the Zeus is just such a great search off of the Elechik, or even just a draw to start sinking the opponent's Elestrals of their stats and be able to more easily hit over them. I think I was debating at one point putting it up to 2 copies, but I decided to try out another card. I also can't remember what it is at this time, but that is a note to make that 2 Zeus might be right in the slot and need to cut something else. I have to look back at the list to figure that one out. And at this point, I only had 12 1-drops, so I wanted, not including Emphrostix, because that's really not 1-drop. So I wanted another 1-drop to round out the list, and I thought, I'm already running a bunch of Thunder because of the Elechik and the Jolten, so why not just run Astrabbit? This is another great search target, can help me find my searches dig deeper, can also help me find Shiveroar a bit more consistently. 5 defense is solid, just seemed like a perfect fit into what this deck was already doing. Moving into the counter-runes, I'm running a very interesting breakdown yet again. There just wasn't as much space because I'm trying to cram a lot of stuff into this deck for the offensive potential, but I ended up going with 2 Tsunami, 2 Altar of Stars, 3 Gorgon's Gaze, 3 PTA, and 2 Shield of Achilles. So kind of similar to last week, though some differences here. 2 Tsunami like last week because I'm expecting water to be played, and that way I hopefully can see in the matches where I'm not up against water, or when the water player goes maybe for an Elestral that isn't water if they're running any of those, but it minimizes my chance of breaking on these when I am up against water. 2 Altar, I wanted to try out this card because it is nice swapping the position of Elestrals, and more importantly, the reason I wanted to try this card out was because it's another answer to the Lavalith. Especially, I'm trying to min-max between expecting a lot of Lavalith, but also expecting a bunch of water, so Altar seems pretty interesting. I've got Nexus Banks and easy access to them to be able to utilize this card. And the other neat thing about Altar is, since I run both Khione and Zeus, while Khione, well, if I have Khione out on board, what I can do with it, there it is if I have maybe just an Astrabbit out on board, or really any Elestral that isn't the Frigicub, I can use Altar to protect it, get a Frost Spirit on it, and all of a sudden, now it's live to ascend into Shiveroar. And since I run the Zeus as well, in earlier game situations, or if I'm still just digging for my pieces, but I have a Zeus on board, I can Altar to the Astrabbit to be able, where's Astrabbit? There we go, to be able to get additional cards as well. So there's definitely some synergies in this deck that can line up, and I also think just as a way to switch an Elestral's position, it's solid. If my opponent goes for my Stadium, just Nexus onto something, switch Lavalith to defense, good to go. 3 Gorgon's Gaze, this one's just the most versatile, and I found no reason not to run it at 3 copies. 3 PTA expecting the Lavalith. Also, I feel like since I'm also expecting water, PTA is not pretty good. It is very good against their slower plays. They got a bunch of 2 or even 1 attackers I can flip PTA up on. If they're in defense, they're not attacking anyway. I'm just getting them out of there real easy. And if it's against, if they don't attack, then it can actually hit for spirit damage. And obviously against Lavalith, it's live and can take that out. 2 Shield of Achilles, this is still great for some random stuff. Shiveroar, and specifically, Shield is great against to be able to answer since it does not target. And just for some other random stuff, maybe like in more Frost, but at the same time, this card, easy pickings for Lavalith, hence why I'm only running it at 2 copies. But still, solid group here. Was at 10 counter runes? Yeah, 10 counter runes, so still a good solid bunch. And it's been working out so far. I'm waiting to see if I need to try to find room to bump these up to help this deck compete, since it is a bit slower, but we'll see after testing it in this tournament. And finally, the generic Invoke runes. 2 Ambrosia, and 3 Resting on Your Laurels. Now that I've gone through this, I really cannot remember what I was thinking of cutting for the 3rd Zeus. So 2 Ambrosia, because just getting extra resources to help survive a bit longer, play more cards is good, especially in this deck. It can enable some really late game Emphrostix Shiveroar plays that sometimes you just are so low that you can't make happen without an Ambrosia. It also can Spirit Correct, which can sometimes be relevant. Then 3 Resting on Your Laurels, I needed removal. I was originally running Earthquake, but it's a bit too clunky on the Spirit deck, so I switched over to this, with the idea being, if I have my Zeus Khione up, I'm usually mounting a lot of advantage anyway, and I don't need the Laurels online anyway. If I'm falling behind, I can try to clean up a bit with Laurels before going for my big play, or just clean up to give me more time. So really, well, obviously if I'm not playing Earthquake, this is the only other option I've really got. Moving on to the spirits, I run 3 Leviaphin, 7 Zaptor, and the 10 Flurrmine. A whole bunch of really neat artworks and holos that I've got built up for these spirits here. But the reason for this ratio is 3 Leviaphin. I do run 3 Narpoon, 2 Tsunami, so it gives me use of 3 of them, as well as being an option just chance and Elestral with if I need to play around Tsunami myself. The 7 Zaptor, because I do run quite a big Thunder Core with the Astrabbits, the Elechiks, and the Joltens, and of course the Zeus. But there's more Thunder. I'm pretty sure there's more Thunder in my deck than Frost, at least in terms of the Elestrals, so it seems a bit weird to have more Frost. But the Frost stuff is a bit more expensive because of the Emphrostix and because of Frigicub wanting to throw out spirits. So this one's also ideal for the generic runes, just to get Frost in the Underworld to fuel Shiveroar and the Frigicub, hence why I max out on it. And it also just means that, again, I can use it on the generic runes and still have plenty going into the late game. And generally speaking, the Thunder's more efficient, thus usually needs a bit less spirit overhead. So that's the reason for those ratios. With the deck list out of the way, let's cut to after the tournament and see how I did. So back from the tournament, and I went 3-1, so the deck did pretty well. While I did end up tied for third with that 3-1 record, compared to, I ended up 5th on the leaderboard for challenge, and that is, I believe, because the 2 people in front of me went undefeated for a round or 2 longer than I did. Hence why I ended up in 5. But in terms of the individual rounds that I played in, round 1, I was up against Morphrost, and I ended up winning that one. I attribute that to a really great play I made against the Indus on my opponent's turn 1. They did get to go first, where I just didn't set any back row. I conserved my cards, attacked over it. My opponent only had 1 back row, so I figured either I get rid of this thing, or I get rid of the 1 back row. It's a win-win for me, and I can move from there, and it worked out. And then I also had, the reason I didn't want to set that back row is because I had great back row to start testing the Abominable, and pretty much I just kept putting pressure on the Abominable with a Zeus and some other stuff, so my opponent just spent a lot of resources trying to keep it on board, recurring it, and eventually I just set up the Emphrostix for a Frigicub into Shiveroar, and it just put on just so much pressure that my opponent folded there at 2 low spirits to effectively answer it. For round 2, this is my loss. I was up against Funglow and with a strong Thunder Core, and funny enough, I didn't actually lose to any of it. It was just Lavalith. I only saw 1 Gorgon's Gaze that entire game. I played a Zeus to try to answer their Astrabbit and just set up for the Lavalith, and since they still had an Astro on board, Laurels wouldn't even got me out of it, even if I did draw into it. And then from there, since I wasn't able to catch up, I really needed those Invoke removals to catch up, or back row, but because I wasn't able to, it happened so early in the game, I hadn't had time to set up to play out the Shiveroar. I didn't really have a way to stick an Elestral on board to get Ascend into Shiveroar. I was just a few turns too slow about getting that up and running, and I think that speaks to one of the weaknesses of this deck, which I'll get to at the end of this segment. Then moving on to round 3, I was up against Wind Toolbox. I got the win in that round. You know I'm getting wins the rest of this round because I've said I had a 3-1 record. But that one actually was pretty close. So the nice thing about Wind Toolbox is they use a lot of spirits, so I can usually threaten lethal as well at the end of the game, and that's kind of what I did. Though I will say the game was very, very close because it literally came down to I wasn't able to play around Tsunami to try to out a Twindra, but if I can attack over it, they would be at 2 low spirits to cast out the Panterror. However, and it also felt really good against Tsunami because my Elestrals had 5 defense. So if Tsunami switched defense, Twindra can't even hit over any of it. It just delays the inevitable by a turn. But what made this interesting was my opponent actually had Panterror in hand to hard ascend into. What further made this interesting was I top deck Shield last turn, and I had the spirits to use it, and which secured me the victory. The other part of this game that I think really helped me was the turn 1 Hydrake. I had just Astrabbits in hand. I had 2 of them. I could just sit on those defensive bodies. Hydrake can't crash to start bringing out Twindra into Panterror, and I could just dig for my answers. Worked out real well. Round 4, I was up against Crowdscorch, not the Morphrost variant. It's piloted by Brewlock. Shout out to Brewlock. I know he loves that deck. Really fun game, a very tense game throughout. And that victory, I boiled down. We discussed it afterwards, and Brewlock said he feels like that is a tough matchup because he kind of just needs to hope I don't have the answers and can run over me, because otherwise he just kind of plays into my win condition of weighing down my opponent and just pressuring them while they have so few spirits they can't really effectively answer, and that's exactly what happened. So in conclusion, for the Shiveroar deck, while it did perform very well today, I do think that this deck, due to how I built it to be very search heavy, and it's naturally slow, it can easily get run over by more aggressive stuff, as I saw with Lavalith in that second game. And because of I only run 3 invoke removals, I don't have a lot of ways to get caught up from that. And then even just my Elestral Pressure plays, they do take more to answer. And I kind of told my opponent doesn't have back row. So that game was also just unfortunate. My opponent just had a ton of live back row, so I just couldn't effectively answer it. And there's just going to be games where it's just Lavalith, ton of back row, you can't do anything about it. So because of that, I do think that this deck naturally would want to run more invoke removal, such as Earthquake. But of course, that would mean trying to find space to include those Earthquakes in both the main deck and the Spirit deck. I don't think it's impossible, but at the same time, you're still hoping to find it anyway. So I don't know if that would necessarily make it so that this deck can now compete. It just would help with that weakness I noticed. The other thing I really felt with this deck is that and this is more from a deck building aspect, not a performance aspect, Frost in general just lacks a lot of good one costs. It's delegated mostly to Morfrost, and I just didn't want to play Morfrost because I would feel like it was just a worse version of Morfrost that runs the Cryover, and I think that's probably just better, and I didn't want to do that. Now, is that the more optimal way to play Shiveroar? Probably, just because you have better early game pressure tools. Your early game just feels better in general, and you still get great consistency. It's just Shiveroar's a nice cherry on top. So it just kind of felt like this deck couldn't carve out much of a identity in Frost outside of just going Shiveroar to try to close out the game or do Frigicub shenanigans. And honestly, even Frigicub, when I was building this deck and trying to decide what I wanted the one cost base to be, I looked at Frigicub, I'm like, this is just the best option I have that isn't Morfrost. It's not that I absolutely love it. It works, but it's all I got as well. So I really do hope Frost gets a lot better one costs moving forward that are more generic, to hopefully give Frost a better just generic Frost core to work with. Because powerful Ascensions like Shiveroar, it's good. It was a phenomenal finisher. And even Frigicub, it felt more like a finisher than anything else. It really felt like I needed better early game than just search. Like, was it good? Oh yeah, I had plenty of hands. I had access to plenty of tools. But what it had in consistency to gaining pieces, it lacked in the ceiling of what the deck can do. That's how I mainly felt about this deck. But of course, this is just one build. I want to pass it off to you all. How are you building Shiveroar? Specifically, that differentiates from me, because I'm not convinced that this is the best version of Shiveroar out there. It's just the one I came up with. And if we can exchange notes to figure out what the best one is, I want to know. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.